He left you behind, but the world never forgets a woman who learns how to rise in silence. Those were the words Emily Carter heard replay in her mind the night Jason Miller walked out of their penthouse overlooking the Hudson River, the city lights below shimmering like distant memories that no longer belonged to her. The air inside the apartment felt unusually still, as if even the walls had learned not to speak. Jason stood near the glass doors, his reflection fractured across the skyline, adjusting the cuff of his watch with the calm precision of a man already living in his next chapter. "This is not working anymore," he said quietly, not with anger, but with the detached tone of someone closing a book he had already finished reading. Emily did not ask him to stay. She did not plead or raise her voice. Instead, she placed the signed papers on the marble kitchen island, the same place where they once shared morning coffee and plans that now felt like echoes from another life. "You will be fine eventually," Jason added, as if offering comfort to a stranger rather than ending years of marriage. Then he turned away, leaving behind a silence heavier than any argument. The door closed softly, but the sound carried through Emily like a final verdict. In the days that followed, the city outside continued its rhythm, indifferent and unchanging. Emily remained in the apartment for exactly 6 more nights. On the 7th morning, she left without ceremony, carrying only a single suitcase and a quiet resolve she did not yet fully understand. There were no dramatic farewells, no final confrontations. Only the steady realization that the life she had built beside Jason had always been a shared illusion, one where her presence had been visible but never truly seen. Jason believed he had freed himself from a relationship that no longer aligned with his ambitions. What he did not know was that Emily had already begun disappearing long before he asked her to leave. She returned to a smaller apartment in Brooklyn, where the windows faced brick walls instead of skylines, and where silence no longer felt like abandonment but like possibility. The first months were unremarkable on the surface. She took consulting work under different names, small projects that required precision but no recognition. She studied markets at night, learned patterns that most people overlooked, and began making decisions that no longer asked for permission. There was no sudden transformation, no moment of cinematic awakening, only discipline, repetition, and an unshakable refusal to remain small. Jason, meanwhile, moved forward as expected. His name appeared in financial publications, his company expanded, and his public image became that of a man who had successfully streamlined his life. Emily was no longer mentioned, not even as a footnote. That silence was interpreted by everyone, including Jason, as resolution. What none of them understood was that silence for Emily had never been absence. It had been preparation. 3 years passed before Jason heard her name again, and when he did, it arrived not through conversation but through numbers on a screen, through deals whispered in boardrooms, through opportunities that seemed to shift entire markets without explanation. The name was not always complete, sometimes only initials, sometimes attached to entities no one could trace directly. It meant nothing to him at first. It should have meant nothing at all. But something about the pattern of influence felt familiar, like a language he had once known but forgotten. And somewhere deep in the architecture of his success, a subtle question began to form, one he would not yet allow himself to answer. Because in Jason Miller's world, people like Emily Carter were supposed to fade, not return. 3 years did not announce themselves in dramatic fashion. They simply arrived one morning and made everything different without asking permission. Emily Carter learned that truth in the quiet rhythm of a life rebuilt far from glass towers and riverfront views. In Brooklyn, she rented a modest apartment where the morning light came through narrow windows and landed softly on a desk filled with market reports, handwritten notes, and a laptop that never fully rested. There was no luxury in her surroundings, but there was control, and control, she discovered, was a form of freedom she had never truly understood before. During those years, she moved through the financial world like a shadow without a name. She entered consulting circles under non-disclosure agreements that kept her identity deliberately absent from recognition. Her insights were precise, almost unsettling in their accuracy, as if she could see patterns others missed by choice or blindness. Companies adjusted strategies based on recommendations that carried only the initials EC, a signature that began appearing more frequently in discussions among executives who never met her but quietly respected the outcomes she produced. Meanwhile, Jason Miller continued to expand his presence in the industry. His company grew into new markets, his interviews became more polished, and his public reputation solidified as a man who understood how to build without distraction. To the outside world, he was succeeding in the way that mattered most. Yet success has a way of narrowing attention rather than expanding it, and Jason had unknowingly narrowed his world until anything outside it felt irrelevant. That included Emily, whose absence he had long since categorized as closure rather than consequence. But closure has a habit of reopening itself in unexpected ways. It began with a report on a flight from Chicago to New York, where Jason glanced through financial briefings during turbulence that caused the cabin lights to dim slightly. A line in the document caught his attention not because it was important on its own, but because it appeared in multiple unrelated sections across different industries. EC involved in restructuring capital flow. EC advising international acquisitions. EC influencing valuation outcomes that even seasoned analysts could not fully explain. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence, a common set of initials belonging to a consulting group or perhaps a firm he had not yet encountered. But the pattern persisted. Over the following months, every time Jason encountered a deal that shifted unexpectedly in the market, those same initials appeared somewhere in the background, always indirect, never exposed. It created a subtle irritation at first, like a missing piece of information just out of reach. Then it became curiosity. And curiosity, in Jason Miller's world, always demanded resolution. He instructed his team to trace the origin, expecting a straightforward answer. Instead, what returned was fragmentation. There was no single company, no registered entity with a stable identity, only layers of contracts and intermediaries that led nowhere definitive. Whoever EC was, they had built not just influence but invisibility. Meanwhile, Emily moved through boardrooms across Europe and Asia under conditions that never required her physical presence to be acknowledged publicly. Her role was never to dominate conversations, but to redirect them without detection. She learned how silence could be more persuasive than argument, how absence could shape decisions more effectively than confrontation. Yet none of it felt like triumph. It felt like precision, like assembling a structure that only made sense when viewed from a distance. One evening, while reviewing projections for a multinational acquisition in Manhattan, she paused briefly at a name in the background documentation. Jason Miller Enterprises. It appeared without emphasis, just another line in a sequence of unrelated transactions. She did not react outwardly. There was no shock, no visible hesitation, only a quiet recognition that time had not erased anything. It had simply redistributed it. She closed the file and continued working. Across the city, Jason stood in his office overlooking the skyline, unaware that the invisible architecture shaping parts of his success had already begun to converge toward a point neither of them had yet named. The first time Jason Miller realized that something in his world was shifting beneath him, it did not arrive as a revelation, but as a pattern he could no longer ignore. It happened during a routine executive briefing in a glass conference room high above Manhattan, where the city stretched outward like a map of ambition. Numbers moved across the screen, projections, acquisitions, and forecasts that normally reinforced his control over the market. Yet his attention drifted when one of his analysts mentioned a restructuring deal that had collapsed unexpectedly overnight. The explanation was vague, attributed to external advisory influence, a phrase that meant nothing on its own but echoed uncomfortably with something Jason had seen before. The initials appeared again. E. No company name, no direct attribution, only the same quiet signature embedded within decisions that reshaped outcomes without announcing their presence. Jason paused, just long enough for the room to notice the silence but not long enough to explain it. He dismissed the meeting with a calmness that masked an unfamiliar sense of unease. Outside the conference room, the city noise returned, but it no longer felt distant. Felt close, almost personal. That evening, he requested a full private audit of every transaction connected to his company over the past 3 years that had shown irregular influence patterns. He did not expect anything meaningful to come from it. Executives often saw ghosts in data when they looked too long. But what returned over the next week was consistency, and consistency is far more unsettling than randomness. Every disrupted acquisition, every unexpectedly favorable renegotiation, every strategic shift that had benefited or challenged his company carried the same invisible thread. It was not a coincidence. It was a presence. Meanwhile, Emily Carter sat in a private office in downtown Manhattan that did not carry her name on the door. The space was minimal, designed for discretion rather than display, with muted lighting and walls that absorbed sound rather than reflected it. She reviewed global financial movements with the calm precision of someone who no longer reacted to volatility, but understood its rhythm. Her work had expanded beyond consulting into quiet structural influence, shaping decisions that moved capital across continents without ever attaching her identity to the outcomes. There was no celebration in her success, no visible satisfaction, only the steady continuation of something she had built one careful decision at a time. That morning, she received a briefing on a pending acquisition involving a technology expansion initiative based in New York. The documents were standard, the language familiar, until she reached the final page where executive affiliations were listed. Jason Miller Enterprises. The name was printed without emphasis, as if it carried no particular weight. She stared at it for a moment longer than necessary, not because it surprised her, but because it confirmed what she had already begun to understand. Their paths were no longer separate. They were converging through systems neither of them fully controlled. Emily closed the file and leaned back slightly, her expression unchanged. There was no emotional shift, no return of memory strong enough to alter her focus. The past had stopped being a place she revisited and had become a structure she simply acknowledged when it appeared. Jason, however, was moving in the opposite direction. The more he investigated, the less control he felt. Not because he was losing power, but because he was beginning to realize that parts of his success may have never belonged solely to him. The realization did not arrive all at once. It arrived in fragments. A delayed approval that had saved his company millions. A competitor withdrawing from a critical market without explanation. A valuation shift that positioned him favorably during a vulnerable expansion phase. Each event alone seemed incidental. Together they formed a shape he could not yet name. One night, long after the city had quieted, Jason stood alone in his office, the skyline reflecting faintly in the glass before him. For the first time in years, he did not think about expansion or strategy. He thought about absence. Not the absence of opportunity, but the absence of understanding. Somewhere in the invisible architecture of his world, something or someone had been present all along. And now that presence was no longer hidden in the background. It was beginning to surface. Jason Miller did not sleep that night. He remained in his office long after the rest of Manhattan had dissolved into a sea of quiet lights, replaying the same fragments of information that now refused to settle into anything orderly. Reports, anomalies, financial irregularities, all pointing toward a single pattern that he could no longer dismiss as coincidence. The initials EC had moved from background noise to a structural force embedded within his success, and that realization carried a weight he could not easily name. By morning he had already escalated the investigation to a private intelligence advisory firm, known for tracing untraceable financial influence. He expected answers within days, perhaps weeks, something concrete that would allow him to categorize what he was seeing and move on. Instead, what returned unsettled him further. The firm reported that EC was not a company in any traditional sense. There were no headquarters, no public filings, no consistent digital identity. Instead, it appeared as a network of decisions, advisors, and intermediary structures that adapted and reformed depending on context. It was influence without visibility, presence without exposure. Jason read the report twice, then a third time, each reading stripping away another layer of certainty he had built his career on. Across the city, Emily Carter stood in a quiet conference room on the 42nd floor of a midtown building, reviewing the same invisible system from the opposite perspective. Her presence in the room was unmarked, her role unannounced, yet every person seated at the table adjusted their decisions subtly around her input without ever acknowledging her as the source. A multinational acquisition was being finalized that morning, one that would shift capital flows across 3 continents. The discussion moved quickly, but Emily's attention remained steady, measured, detached. She did not seek recognition, nor did she require it. Her influence existed in the structure of outcomes, not in the attention of observers. When the final agreement was approved, there was a brief moment of silence, the kind that follows decisions too large to immediately comprehend. No one in the room looked at Emily directly, but several of them. unconsciously adjusted their posture as if acknowledging a presence they could not formally define. Later that afternoon, Emily returned to her private office where the city skyline stretched out beyond reinforced glass. A notification waited on her secure terminal. It was not marked urgent, but it carried a familiarity she could not ignore. Jason Miller Enterprises had been flagged within an internal risk alignment review, not for failure, but for unexpected alignment with multiple high-impact structural shifts. She did not open the file immediately. Instead, she stood by the window for several seconds, observing the movement of traffic below, each car a reminder of systems within systems, all intersecting without awareness of their own design. When she finally opened the document, she saw his name embedded within layers of analysis that suggested growing exposure to the very network she had shaped quietly over years. Jason was no longer outside her reach. He was inside the perimeter of her influence without realizing it. Meanwhile, Jason received a separate briefing that evening, one that did not come through official channels but through a trusted intermediary who had grown visibly cautious in delivery. There had been a scheduled strategic expansion in Southeast Asia that was unexpectedly restructured at the last stage. The reason, according to the report, was alignment with a higher-level advisory influence that had been pre-approved by governing stakeholders. The name associated with the approval was not disclosed. Only the initials appeared again. AC. Jason closed the file slowly, his expression unchanged, but something in his posture shifted subtly, as if the foundation beneath his understanding had begun to tilt. For the first time he stopped trying to identify EC as an external actor. Instead, he began considering a possibility he had avoided since the first report. That this presence was not entering his world now. It had always been inside it. And somewhere in the distance between recognition and denial, a silent convergence was already taking shape. The silence in Jason Miller's office had begun to feel different in the days after the latest reports arrived. It was no longer the silence of control, but the silence of observation, as if the room itself had become aware that something beyond his understanding was watching back. He sat alone at a long glass desk overlooking Manhattan, the skyline no longer inspiring ambition but instead reflecting a growing sense of uncertainty he refused to name aloud. Every document on his screen pointed to the same impossible conclusion. The influence shaping parts of his company's trajectory was not external in the way he had originally believed. It was integrated, distributed, and embedded within systems he himself had once approved without question. Each layer of analysis confirmed that EC did not operate as an isolated actor. It operated as architecture. Meanwhile, Emily Carter moved through a separate, but increasingly connected reality. That morning, she attended a closed financial review meeting, where representatives from multiple global institutions gathered to finalize decisions that would affect long-term capital flow across several industries. Her presence was quiet, her participation minimal in appearance, but every recommendation she had previously made now formed the foundation of the final structure being approved. There was no acknowledgement of her as the origin of those decisions. That was intentional. Emily understood that recognition often disrupted stability, and stability was far more valuable than visibility. As the meeting concluded, she left the room without ceremony and returned to her private office, where the city stretched endlessly beyond reinforced glass. On her desk was a new briefing, marked for her attention by a secure internal channel. It detailed a series of behavioral patterns emerging within a major United States-based enterprise, Jason Miller Enterprises. The report suggested increasing dependency on advisory inputs that could not be fully traced or verified. She read it without visible reaction, her expression remaining steady, as if reviewing data that belonged to someone else's life rather than her own past. Yet something subtle shifted in her awareness. Not emotion, not nostalgia, but recognition of inevitability. The distance between them was no longer widening. It was narrowing through systems neither of them controlled directly. Jason, unaware of her proximity to his operational sphere, continued to search for answers through conventional means. He authorized additional audits, expanded oversight protocols, and initiated internal reviews designed to isolate the origin of the influence affecting his company. Each attempt produced more complexity rather than clarity. Advisors reported inconsistencies in decision chains that seemed to adapt whenever examined too closely. It was as if the system responded to observation itself, reshaping its own visibility. Late that evening, Jason stood by the window of his office, watching the movement of lights across the river. For the first time since the investigation began, he considered the possibility that what he was pursuing was not something he had lost track of, but something that had always been beyond his ability to see clearly. A presence that did not announce itself, but instead integrated itself into outcomes until it became indistinguishable from success or failure. Across the city, Emily reviewed a final set of projections before closing her system for the night. The data confirmed what she had already begun to anticipate. Jason Miller Enterprises was no longer an independent variable in the market structure she was shaping. It had become a dependent node within a larger framework of decisions that would eventually converge at a single point of exposure. She did not alter the trajectory. She did not intervene. She simply acknowledged it, as one might acknowledge the approach of a distant storm already forming beyond the horizon. Neither of them spoke of the other. Yet both were now moving within the same invisible current, one shaped by past decisions, silence, and the slow accumulation of consequences that neither time nor distance had been able to erase. The first sign that something irreversible was already in motion did not come from a report or a meeting, but from a simple delay in response. Jason Miller noticed it during a routine approval cycle that should have taken less than an hour. Instead, it stretched into an entire day without explanation. There was no rejection, no objection, only silence in the system where decisions used to flow predictably. When he pressed for clarification, his internal advisory team responded with carefully worded uncertainty, stating that the delay was due to alignment recalibration within higher-level structural inputs. It was a phrase that sounded technical but meant nothing concrete, and that lack of clarity irritated him more than any direct opposition ever could. Meanwhile, Emily Carter observed the same event from a different layer of the same system. She was seated in a quiet executive environment overlooking downtown Manhattan, reviewing global allocation shifts that were subtly adjusting in real time. The delay in Jason Miller Enterprises' approval cycle had not been caused by failure, but by recalibration of influence thresholds that she had previously authorized within broader market structuring protocols. Nothing had been stopped. Everything had simply been repositioned. She did not react emotionally to this, because emotion had long stopped being a useful measure in her decisions. Instead, she studied the ripple effect. The adjustment had already impacted two adjacent portfolios and created a brief instability in a Southeast Asia expansion model that Jason's company depended on for its next fiscal quarter projections. It was small in appearance but significant in implication. Across the city, Jason stood in his office reviewing the same instability through a different lens. His analyst described it as a temporary market distortion, but Jason no longer accepted surface explanations. He had learned over the past weeks that every minor inconsistency connected to a larger unseen structure. That structure always returned to the same pattern. He no longer treated the initials as an abstraction. They had become a presence that shaped outcomes without revealing intent. He ordered a direct trace of authorization pathways tied to the recalibration event, expecting resistance. What he did not expect was confirmation. The approval had not come from a competitor, a regulator, or an external advisory firm. It had originated within a distributed decision network embedded across multiple institutions, one that his company had interacted with indirectly for years without ever identifying its source. The signature at the deepest verified layer was once again the same. EC. Jason did not speak for several minutes after reading the report. The city beyond his window continued moving as if nothing had changed, but inside his perception, something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer about financial advantage or market unpredictability. It was about authorship. Somewhere, someone had been shaping parts of his success without his knowledge, and more importantly, without his consent. Meanwhile, Emily closed her system after completing a final review cycle for the day. The recalibration she had authorized was not designed to disrupt Jason Miller Enterprises, but to test structural responsiveness within a controlled feedback loop. His company had responded exactly as predicted, confirming a level of dependency that had been gradually forming over years of indirect interaction. She stood by the window of her office for a moment, observing the city lights spread across Manhattan like an interconnected neural pattern. There was no satisfaction in what she saw, only confirmation. Jason was no longer operating outside her influence network. He was operating within it, reacting to shifts he could not yet fully interpret. That realization did not change her direction, but it did narrow the space between past and present in a way that could no longer be ignored. Somewhere across the same skyline, Jason Miller finally understood that what he had been chasing was not a competitor, not a consultant, and not a coincidence. It was a system that had already decided it did not need to announce itself in order to be real. And at the center of that system, whether he was ready or not, was the one person he had once believed he had left behind entirely. The distance between understanding and confirmation is often measured in silence, and for Jason Miller that silence had become unbearable. After the last structural recalibration event, he no longer treated his office as a place of control, but as a place of observation. Every screen, every report, every delayed response now felt like part of a system that was quietly responding to him rather than obeying him. He had stopped asking whether EC was real. That question had already been answered by repetition. What remained was the far more difficult question of intention. Why would an unseen influence stabilize parts of his company for years, only to begin revealing itself now through structural inconsistencies that forced attention rather than avoided it? Meanwhile, Emily Carter continued her work with the same precision that had defined her transformation over the past years. In a secure executive review held across multiple encrypted channels, she evaluated the long-term stability of interconnected portfolios that now included indirect exposure to Jason Miller Enterprises. The data was not presented as personal history, yet she could trace its internal rhythm with clarity that required no explanation. Jason's company was no longer an isolated entity. It had become part of a broader system she had gradually shaped through controlled influence, adjustments, and silent alignment protocols that operated beneath traditional market visibility. She did not think of him as a person within that system during these evaluations. She thought of him as a variable within a structure that had evolved beyond individual ownership. Still, memory is not easily removed by logic alone. Later that evening, Emily remained in her office after the rest of the building had begun to empty. The city outside was illuminated in steady motion, but her attention drifted briefly to a file that had been flagged earlier in the day. It contained a retrospective analysis of key decision points in Jason Miller Enterprises over the past 5 years. She opened it without urgency, scrolling through events that had once defined his rise. Expansion milestones, successful acquisitions, market recoveries during periods of instability. Each one carried subtle markers of external stabilization influence, markers that she now recognized as originating from frameworks she had personally approved during earlier stages of her strategic separation from emotional variables. Jason had built his success within systems she had helped stabilize without ever intending for him to know. That realization did not bring regret, but it did bring structure to something that had remained undefined for a long time. Across the city, Jason stood in his office reviewing the latest internal audit summary. His analysts had finally acknowledged what could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The influence pattern was not reactive. It was anticipatory. Decisions within his company had been subtly aligned with external stabilization forces long before he had even recognized their existence. This meant that what he had been investigating was not a recent intrusion, but a long-standing integration. The implications were difficult to accept, because they contradicted his understanding of independence, ownership, and success. He leaned back slowly, staring at the reflection of city lights against the glass. For the first time, he considered the possibility that every major turning point in his career may have been influenced by a presence he never acknowledged, a presence that did not compete with him, but quietly guided the conditions around him. Meanwhile, Emily closed the file and allowed herself a moment of stillness. There was no celebration in the confirmation she had just reviewed, only clarity. Jason Miller Enterprises was no longer outside her framework. It had been inside it for years, shaped indirectly through decisions that were never meant to be visible as control. The only difference now was that the edges of that structure were becoming noticeable to the person living within it. And as that awareness began to form on his side, the distance between them was no longer measured in years or cities. It was measured in recognition. And recognition, once it begins, rarely stops at the surface. The shift did not announce itself with clarity, but with a gradual change in how Jason Miller experienced time. Meetings that once felt structured now felt slightly unstable, as if unseen adjustments were occurring just outside the edges of perception. Decisions that used to align with predictable outcomes began to arrive with unexpected precision, sometimes benefiting his company in ways that defied conventional forecasting models. At first, he interpreted this as residual effects of complex market dynamics, but that explanation no longer held emotional weight. Something fundamental had changed in how causality itself seemed to behave around his organization. Meanwhile, Emily Carter continued operating within the invisible architecture she had spent years refining. In a secured strategic coordination session, she reviewed a long-horizon stability map covering multiple sectors across North America and Europe. Jason Miller Enterprises appeared not as a focal point, but as a structurally integrated node within a wider equilibrium framework. Its performance was stable, its growth trajectory aligned, but its responsiveness to external shifts had increased in a way that required subtle recalibration. Emily observed this without interruption. There was no need to intervene directly. The system was functioning exactly as designed, and any deviation was being naturally absorbed by its own adaptive structure. Yet within that precision, there was a subtle layer of awareness that Emily could not ignore entirely. Jason was no longer just a participant within the system. He was beginning to perceive it. That perception changed the nature of the entire framework. Across Manhattan, Jason stood in his office during the late afternoon, reviewing performance summaries that now contained anomalies he could no longer dismiss as statistical noise. His analysts reported that several independent advisory channels had simultaneously adjusted guidance on sectors directly tied to his expansion strategy. The adjustments were not contradictory, but synchronized in a way that suggested a single underlying coordination layer. When Jason requested identification of the source, the response returned once again as incomplete. Not absent, not unknown, but distributed beyond conventional classification. And then quietly, the same identifier appeared again in the metadata chain. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he stared at the screen long after the room had fallen into silence around him, as if waiting for the system itself to correct what he was seeing. But nothing changed. The pattern remained stable, as if it had always been there and only now allowed itself to be noticed. Meanwhile, Emily completed a recalibration review affecting several long-term exposure pathways that indirectly intersected with Jason's enterprise. The adjustments were not dramatic. They were subtle refinements designed to maintain equilibrium across interconnected systems. But within those refinements lay an unintended consequence she had begun to recognize over the past cycles. Jason's visibility within the structure was increasing, not through exposure, but through comprehension. The system was no longer invisible to him in the way it once was. He was beginning to map it. That realization introduced a new variable into Emily's otherwise controlled framework. Not instability but awareness. And awareness, once introduced, cannot be fully contained by design. That evening, Jason left his office earlier than usual. He walked through the streets of Manhattan without distraction, the city moving around him in familiar rhythm, yet feeling fundamentally altered in meaning. Every reflection in glass, every passing conversation, every distant light now seemed to exist within a larger pattern he could almost perceive but not yet fully decode. Somewhere within that pattern, he no longer felt like the center of his own story. And somewhere far beyond his immediate reach, the source of that realization remained quietly in place, unchanged, observing the system she had built continue to evolve beyond the limits of her original intent. The first time Jason Miller understood that visibility had replaced mystery, it was not because the system revealed itself, but because it stopped hiding its edges from his perception. He began noticing patterns not just in financial reports, but in timing, in alignment, in the way decisions across different departments seemed to converge toward outcomes that no single internal team could have coordinated independently. It was as if an unseen intelligence was gently guiding the structure of his entire enterprise, not controlling it in a direct sense, but shaping the conditions under which every choice became inevitable. That realization did not bring comfort. It brought a quiet, persistent disorientation that followed him even when he left the office. Meanwhile, Emily Carter stood within a controlled observation environment in Midtown Manhattan, reviewing a consolidated system map that displayed the full interconnected influence framework she had developed over years of iterative refinement. Jason Miller Enterprises appeared within it as a stabilized node, no longer fragile or emerging, but fully integrated into a broader equilibrium network that extended across multiple industries and financial corridors. His company was no longer being influenced in isolated moments. It was being maintained within a continuous structural balance that ensured long-term predictability across global variables. Yet something had changed in the latest system feedback cycle. Jason was no longer reacting only to outcomes. He was beginning to recognize the structure behind them. That recognition was not complete, but it was accelerating. Emily paused for a moment longer than usual when she saw the latest behavioral projection update. Jason's internal decision latency had decreased, not because of increased efficiency, but because of pattern anticipation. He was starting to predict adjustments before they occurred. This was not something the system had been designed to encourage at this stage of integration. It introduced the possibility of awareness interfering with equilibrium stability. Across the city, Jason attended a private executive forum where discussions centered on global market positioning and emerging structural risks. The conversation moved in familiar cycles of analysis and projection, but Jason found himself listening differently. He was no longer only interpreting content. He was interpreting structure. Every recommendation, every strategic suggestion, every subtle alignment of opinion now felt connected to something larger that was not being explicitly acknowledged in the room. When one of the senior advisors referenced a recurring advisory signature influencing multiple sectors, Jason's attention sharpened immediately. The speaker did not elaborate, but the implication was clear enough. The same initials appeared in the background documentation once again. EC. Jason did not interrupt the discussion, but internally, something locked into place. The pattern was no longer abstract. It was persistent, coordinated, and increasingly impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Later that evening, Emily reviewed the same advisory cycle from her position within the system architecture. The stability metrics remained within optimal thresholds, but Jason's cognitive mapping behavior had reached a new phase. He was no longer simply observing anomalies. He was assembling them into structure. That transformation marked a critical threshold in the design she had originally implemented years ago, without intending this outcome. The system had been built for influence, not recognition. Yet recognition was emerging anyway. Emily stood by the window of her office, watching the city below move in uninterrupted rhythm. There was no emotional reaction to the data, only an acknowledgement of trajectory. Jason Miller was no longer separated from the system that had once shaped his success. He was beginning to perceive his position within it. And once a system becomes visible to the one who exists inside it, the relationship between control and understanding can no longer remain unchanged. Somewhere across Manhattan, Jason Miller stopped for a moment in the middle of walking through the night streets. He looked at the city lights stretching into the distance, and for the first time, he did not see chaos or opportunity. He saw structure. Not fully formed, not fully understood, but undeniably present. And in that moment of incomplete clarity, the boundary between his past assumptions and present reality quietly began to dissolve. The meeting room was already empty when Jason Miller finally stopped speaking. The last executive had left without asking further questions, as if unconsciously aware that any explanation now would no longer reach the part of Jason's mind that had already shifted beyond conventional interpretation. He remained seated alone at the long table, the surface reflecting faint traces of overhead light, his hands resting still as if any movement might disrupt the fragile clarity he was trying to maintain. For the first time, he was no longer asking what was happening to his company. He was asking what had always been happening underneath it. The distinction mattered more than anything he had ever encountered in business. Meanwhile, across Midtown Manhattan, Emily Carter reviewed the latest system convergence report, inside a secured analytical environment that displayed global financial interactions as layered structural flows. Jason Miller Enterprises appeared again within a refined stability cluster, but this time the system had flagged a deviation in interpretive response rather than operational performance. Jason was no longer simply reacting to influence patterns. He was interpreting them. That shift, while subtle in measurement, represented a fundamental transition in system behavior. Emily did not interrupt the process. The framework was designed to accommodate gradual cognitive emergence within controlled boundaries. However, the current trajectory suggested that Jason's perception of structure was accelerating faster than projected tolerance thresholds. She adjusted a series of long-horizon balancing parameters not to suppress the awareness, but to ensure that its progression remained stable rather than disruptive. Across the city, Jason stood near the window of his office once more, but this time he was not looking outward. He was looking inward through the accumulation of every anomaly he had documented over the past weeks. The delays, the synchronized advisory shifts, the repeated presence of the same identifying signature, EC. It no longer felt like a series of isolated events. It felt like a coordinated architecture that had been present long before he had ever chosen to notice it. When his internal system flagged a newly updated advisory alignment affecting his company's next strategic expansion, he opened the document without hesitation. The adjustment was not corrective. It was anticipatory. It had been implemented before any internal decision had been made, as if the outcome had already been accounted for in advance. That realization did not create panic. It created a stillness deeper than uncertainty. Somewhere in that stillness, understanding began to take shape. Not full comprehension but structural recognition. Meanwhile, Emily reviewed a secondary projection layer that mapped Jason's evolving interpretive capacity. His cognitive modeling of the system had reached a threshold where independent reconstruction of influence pathways was now possible. In simpler terms, he was no longer only experiencing the system. He was beginning to rebuild it in his mind. This marked a critical divergence point. Once a participant within the system begins reconstructing its architecture independently, the relationship between observer and structure can no longer remain one-directional. Emily stood quietly as she studied the projected outcomes. There was no resistance in her response, only calculation. The system had always been adaptive by design, but adaptation now required acknowledgement of awareness within its own structure. Jason Miller was no longer just a subject of influence. He was becoming a reader of it. And in that transformation, the distance between them, once defined by years of silence and separation, began to collapse into a single unavoidable convergence. That night, Jason left his office without finalizing any additional directives. He walked through the streets of Manhattan, not as a man seeking answers, but as someone beginning to understand that the answers had been surrounding him long before he learned how to see them. Every reflection, every intersection of light and movement, now felt like part of a larger design that extended beyond intention or coincidence. And somewhere beyond his immediate perception, the unseen architecture that had shaped both his success and his confusion continued to adjust itself in response to the fact that it was finally being understood. The invitation arrived without ceremony, yet it carried a weight that neither Jason Miller nor Emily Carter could ignore. It was not a public announcement or a scheduled industry event. It was a private convergence notice issued through a restricted financial intelligence channel, one that only appeared when multiple high-level systems reached synchronized alignment. The location was a closed executive assembly in Manhattan, a space reserved for individuals whose decisions influence cross-continental capital structures. Jason received the notice first, his expression unchanged as he read the brief message on his secured device. No explanation was provided for his inclusion, only confirmation of attendance. Meanwhile, across the city, Emily Carter reviewed the same convergence event through a separate advisory layer. The system had initiated a controlled intersection protocol between multiple influence nodes, and Jason Miller Enterprises had been selected as a focal participant. More importantly, Jason himself had been flagged as cognitively aligned with structural awareness thresholds that made direct exposure to system architecture both possible and unavoidable. Emily did not object to the designation. She simply observed it. That evening, Jason arrived at the designated building in Midtown Manhattan. There were no visible signs indicating the importance of the location, only subtle security layers embedded within access control systems that responded instantly to his credentials. Inside, the environment was minimal, almost deliberately neutral, as if designed to remove distraction and amplify perception. He was escorted into a circular conference space where a small number of executives were already present, none of whom acknowledged him directly. Instead, their attention appeared divided between the room and something beyond it, as if waiting for a final element to complete the structure of the meeting itself. Jason took a seat without speaking. He no longer felt the need to assert presence in environments where influence operated beneath language. Minutes later, Emily Carter entered through a separate access point. There was no announcement of her arrival. She simply became visible within the space, as if she had always been part of its design. Jason saw her immediately. The recognition did not arrive as surprise. It arrived as confirmation. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them was measured not in years or geography, but in accumulated systems of silence, decisions, and unseen influence. Emily took her seat across from him, her expression composed, her presence controlled with the same precision she applied to every system she managed. The room remained silent as the final structural brief was activated. A projection displayed layered maps of interconnected financial networks, showing how influence, capital, and decision pathways had evolved over time across multiple global markets. Jason watched the visualization unfold, and for the first time he saw not just patterns but authorship. He began to understand that many of the outcomes he had attributed to chance or skill had been shaped within frameworks he had never been aware of. Slowly, his gaze returned to Emily. There was no hostility in his expression, no demand for explanation, only recognition forming into clarity. Emily met his gaze without resistance. She had anticipated this moment not as confrontation, but as convergence. The system did not require conflict to resolve imbalance. It required awareness to stabilize interpretation. One of the senior coordinators in the room spoke calmly, explaining that the convergence protocol had been initiated to align all dependent systems with emerging awareness thresholds. Jason Miller Enterprises was no longer being evaluated as an independent entity, but as part of a larger integrated structure that required conscious acknowledgement from its primary decision vector. In simpler terms, Jason was no longer outside the system. He was inside its comprehension layer. Silence followed the explanation. Jason leaned slightly forward, not in disbelief, but in measured understanding. For the first time, he was not trying to decode what had happened to his success. He was beginning to understand the framework that had shaped it. Emily remained still, her presence steady, neither defensive nor explanatory. The truth between them no longer required interpretation. It only required recognition. And in that shared silence, the final boundary between observer and structure quietly dissolved. The room remained silent for several seconds after the projection stabilized, as if even the system itself was waiting for human interpretation to catch up with what had just been revealed. Jason Miller did not speak. His eyes moved slowly across the layered visualization still suspended in the air, mapping decades of financial behavior, advisory influence, and structural adjustments that had shaped not only his company, but entire sectors he once believed were independent. What he was seeing was no longer a series of coincidences or isolated advantages. It was continuity. It was design. Across from him, Emily Carter remained still, her presence composed in a way that did not invite interpretation or emotional response. She had entered this moment without expectation of control over how it would unfold, only responsibility for maintaining stability within a system that had now reached a point of mutual visibility. Jason finally broke his silence, but his voice was calm, almost detached, as if he was speaking from a position slightly removed from his own history. He did not ask how long this had been happening. He did not ask why. Instead, he asked a simpler question that carried far greater weight. How much of what I built was ever truly mine? The question did not echo in the room, yet it changed the atmosphere immediately. The executive's presence shifted subtly, not in discomfort, but in recognition that the conversation had moved beyond operational explanation. Emily met his gaze for the first time without deflection. Her answer was not immediate, because it did not belong to emotion or justification. It belonged to structure. What you built was real, she said quietly. But it existed inside a system that shaped probability long before outcomes became visible. Jason absorbed this without interruption. There was no visible reaction of anger or disbelief, only recalibration, as if a long-held internal model was being carefully rewritten in real time without collapsing its foundation. The projection behind them adjusted slightly, not because the system had changed but because interpretation thresholds had shifted. Jason was no longer a passive observer of influence architecture. He was now part of its recognition layer. Emily continued, her voice steady, explaining that the convergence protocol was never about control in the traditional sense. It was about stabilization of interconnected outcomes across global systems that had grown too complex to remain fully decentralized. Individual success, failure, and growth had all been influenced by layered probability management, designed to prevent systemic collapse. Jason listened, not as a man defending his past, but as someone trying to understand its true context. The silence that followed her explanation was not empty. It was structural. It contained every unanswered assumption he had carried for years. Slowly, Jason leaned back in his chair. His gaze returned once more to the projection, but now he was seeing it differently. Not as a map of influence but as a reflection of interdependence. Every node, every adjustment, every shift in direction now appeared less like manipulation and more like maintenance of equilibrium across systems too vast for isolated perception. Emily observed him carefully. This was the moment the system had prepared for but could not guarantee. Recognition without collapse. Understanding without fragmentation. Jason finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. If I can see it now, does that mean I am part of it moving forward? The question was not rhetorical. It was structural acceptance. Emily did not hesitate. Yes, she said simply. The system does not separate awareness from participation. It integrates both. At that moment, something shifted that no projection captured directly. It was not a change in data but in relationship. Jason Miller was no longer standing outside the architecture of influence that had shaped his life. He was standing within it, fully aware, fully present, and no longer resisting its existence. Emily allowed the silence to remain. There was nothing more to explain. The convergence had already completed its transition from observation to recognition. And in that quiet understanding, the distance between them did not disappear, but it stopped being a separation. It became structure shared between 2 points within the same system. The silence that followed the final confirmation did not feel like an ending. It felt like a recalibration of everything that had come before it. Jason Miller remained seated in the convergence room, but the experience of being in the room no longer carried the same meaning it once had. The boundaries between observer, participant, and structure had already dissolved in ways that could not be reversed. The projection that had once displayed layers of global influence was now dimmed to a minimal state, no longer revealing systems as separate components, but as interconnected continuities. Jason no longer saw the architecture as something external. He saw it as an extension of shared awareness. Across from him, Emily Carter stood at the edge of the same realization, her presence steady but no longer isolated behind operational distance. The system had reached a state where control was no longer the defining principle. Integration was. Jason finally rose from his seat, not in departure, but in acceptance of movement within the structure itself. When he spoke, his voice carried a calm that had replaced every earlier version of uncertainty he had ever known. He said that he no longer needed to know every layer of how things had been shaped. What mattered now was understanding how to exist within what had already been revealed. Emily listened without interruption. For the first time, there was no asymmetry between what she knew and what he understood. The convergence had eliminated that gap. Not by erasing information but by aligning perception. She responded simply, explaining that the system was never designed to create separation between those who influence and those who are influenced. It was designed to maintain balance in a world where decisions, capital, and human intent constantly reshape one another. Jason nodded slowly, not in agreement but in recognition. He was no longer interpreting the system as a mystery. He was interpreting it as a responsibility. The final structural layer of the convergence protocol stabilized, and with it, all remaining visualizations in the room faded into a neutral state. There was nothing left to reveal because nothing remained hidden in the same way it once had been. The unseen architecture that had shaped his past success was no longer something operating around him. It was something operating with him. Emily took a step closer, not to close distance but to acknowledge alignment. She told him that awareness did not grant control, but it did change the nature of participation. From this point forward, decisions would no longer be interpreted as isolated actions. They would be understood as contributions to a continuous system of equilibrium. Jason understood that fully now. His entire history, once fragmented into moments of loss, gain, confusion, and acceleration, had always been part of a larger continuity he had not been able to perceive until this moment. He no longer felt like someone who had been manipulated by unseen forces. He felt like someone who had finally learned to read the structure he had always lived inside. As the meeting space gradually transitioned into closure mode, the remaining executives exited without ceremony. There was no need for formal conclusion, because the system itself had already resolved the purpose of their gathering. Jason and Emily remained for a moment longer, standing within a space that now felt less like a room and more like a shared point of understanding within a much larger framework. Jason looked at her one final time, not as someone who had once been distant, nor as someone who had once been unreachable, but as someone whose presence had been woven into the structure of everything he now understood. There was no demand for reconciliation, no need for correction, and no trace of the imbalance that had once defined their separation. Emily gave a slight nod, acknowledging not an ending, but a continuation under new conditions. And as Jason left the room, he did not walk away from his past. He moved forward within it, fully aware that every step he would take from that moment onward was already part of a system that no longer concealed itself from him. It only asked that he now move within it consciously, as both participant and witness, within the same unbroken structure of reality that had finally become visible.